Well, my name is Ken Serfass. I'm a trainman of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I've been in service for about 25 years now, and made my way up the ranks from being just a brakeman through conductor. I'm sometimes a freight conductor. Sometimes I get to be a fireman and shoveling coal on our steam locomotives. So one of our yard masters had compiled a number of stories about different things. You know, the yard master does a lot of sitting around when he's not out counting cars and marking up things. And they have a lot of time to think between all the train stuff that they have to do in the yard. So the different railroad men that he meets tell him different stories, and over time he's compiled all this into his yard master's book. And I came across that and thought, well, that'd be fun to share with everybody. So I have for you 5 railroad ghost stories. And some of them you may be familiar with, at least some of the subject matter. You know who President Lincoln was. And have you heard of the general of the great locomotive chase fame down in Georgia? So I have some stories about those, and I have some other things as well. So nothing's going to be too terribly scary. I don't think it'll make you stay up at night without the lights on. So without further ado, I'd like to share with you 5 railroad ghost stories. Abraham Lincoln's funeral train. On the morning of April 19, 1865, Abraham Lincoln's funeral train drifted out of a Washington City terminal to visit hundreds of thousands of grief-stricken citizens in 400 communities bound for Springfield, Illinois, his final resting place as our fallen president. Folks all along the route would come by the track and line up to pay tribute as the train would pass them by. Now, just because you were born more than a century too late for the spectacle of Abraham Lincoln's funeral train, you aren't too late for its specter. The ghost of this funeral train is said to retrace its route on the anniversary of its sad trip. Many people have reported that they will suddenly feel a cold rush of air on the track, seemingly out of nowhere. Then, as they look up, they'll see a ghostly headlight piercing the night sky. As it travels onward, they'll see an old-fashioned locomotive of the type such as that famous general of the great locomotive chase, pulling a long, dark train of about 8 cars, the last being the famous presidential car. And if you haven't seen the presidential car, it was a mammoth passenger car with 8-wheeled trucks on either end of it. It was so heavy that most times if it was even moved around, it had to have 2 locomotives pulling it. And it was the first other than a carriage that the president would ride in, it was the first official conveyance built specifically for the president of the United States. And the only time Lincoln got to ride in it was after he had passed away. But that was the car that's on the back of the funeral train that carried his remains as it went on this tour. That car was especially made as the official parlor car of the U.S. president, just in time for Lincoln's second inauguration. But sadly, as I said, his first and only ride would be as a corpse, returning to his home state and eternal rest. In case there's any doubt that what you are witnessing is an actual supernatural sight and not being fooled by some type of historical reenactment, witnesses will tell you that if you look through the windows of the passing cars, you can see the president's coffin is laid out and an ever-vigilant group of Union soldiers, which some describe as ghosts and others describe as skeletons, keep watch over the flag-draped casket as if guarding the president for all eternity. Flags and streamers attached to the train whip in the wind, but no sound is heard from them, the engine, or the wheels of the cars. Over the years, there have even been reports of Lincoln's ghost train encountering a real train, and if it does, it passes right through it as it rolls on to its final destination. Hundreds have reported seeing the ghost train traveling through the countryside, and it has been rumored that clocks and watches stop running when the train passes by. Some report hearing nothing but silence as the spectral funeral makes its procession. Others say they hear mournful music playing as the train passes from the ghost of Lincoln's favorite, the U.S. Marine Band. Many claim to see smoke billowing from the stack and hear an eerie train whistle mournfully calling out to passers-by to pay their last respects. I have not yet seen it myself. But along the route of the Pennsylvania Railroad, it's quite possible we could, because much of the track is still in place. Definitely track laid over the original route, because the same route that Lincoln took going from Springfield to Washington ran that same route in reverse. So it came right up through, out of Baltimore, up into Pennsylvania, through Hanover Junction, came up past Gap near the Strasburg Railroad on the Pennsylvania main line, making its way through Harrisburg, eventually around Horseshoe Curve in Altoona, and heading out to Illinois from there. So you might have a chance to see it if you're on the right set of track. Now, that's not the only place we have ghost trains, because that's multi-state as well, and the Pennsylvania Railroad can't really lay claim to all of it. But I'm going to tell you now about the Reaper train that was seen in Newark, New Jersey. Another haunted train, Newark, New Jersey, around 1948 at the Jersey Central Railroad Station in Newark. The tale begins with the station master, who is trying to calm down what appears to be an old vagabond running about his station area and making a ruckus among the waiting passengers. When the station master talks to him, the old man claims that the express train to hell is coming for him, because he once killed a man who had cheated him at cards. The station master could only assume the old man is unwell and tries to shake off the troubling sound of his pleas for help. He wants to keep his station area calm, and he's noticing that many of the people waiting for trains or walking by are taking an uneasy notice of this old man. As this guy goes on and bemoans his perceived fate, he drifts away from the reach of the station master and ambles toward the edge of the platform that stands beside the track. Station masters take a step forward to get him, but pauses, believing the old man is just a little scared and only wants to be left alone. Now, just before midnight that night, the sound of a steam train chugging through the night is approaching, sounding as if it has no intention of stopping. Incoming trains will sound their bell and their whistle to warn people back from the track and to announce their arrivals. This train sounds like it's on a highball. Looking down the line from the platform, the station master checked his pocket watch and he frowned. He hears the old man cry out as he rises from a crouched stance, "Here she comes! My fate lies before me in the spirit of the Blue Comet!" Station master watches the old man stand up, and he worries that the guy will jump off the platform and right in front of the engine. Station master seems a little confused, and he's trying to think on his feet of the local arrivals on the timetable, as the next train isn't scheduled until after midnight. Without any reason, he feels the familiar vibration at his feet that a passing steam locomotive produces. But he looks first at his feet and then to the track. Nothing is there. Despite the loud sound of the engine, the tooting whistle, and the rushing wind that comes from a passing train, the station master doesn't see anything traveling on the rails in front of him. More worrisome is that this unseeable train doesn't seem to be stopping as would be normal, but it's barreling along like she's the Hotshot Limited, been given the highball on the main line to pass a sitting freight. As he rushes from the station door to the edge of the platform, he tries to pull the old man away from the tracks and to safety. The rushing wind is picked up to almost hurricane level, causing the station master to close his eyes against the leads and ticket stubs blown into swirls around him. He desperately tries to hold on to the old man's tattered jacket, but can only hope to find him in the sudden storm about him. The poor old man tugs away from his grasp, gives one terrible final wail, and vanishes from the station master's grip without a trace. Station master opened his eyes slowly as the storm dissipates, breathlessly looking at his watch. It turns out the express train to hell had in fact come for the old man, and it came dead on at midnight. That's what they tell you in New Jersey. You don't know, you can't believe everybody. However, I had mentioned the General a little bit earlier, so I'd like to tell you about the Western and Atlantic ghost train. In the 1870s, a ghost train was on the line reported in Georgia newspapers. But in the 1880s, not far outside of Dalton, a phantom locomotive was witnessed charging along the tracks. An 1881 article from the Marietta Journal reads as such, titled "A Phantom Locomotive." We learned that a mysterious apparition was seen one night recently, which was nothing more or less than a phantom locomotive. The narrator, whose name was withheld, was walking the track of the WNARR about 2 miles from town one night last week when he discovered the headlight of an engine approaching around a curve. Strange to say, he heard no noise as the train came on, and presently he stepped from the track and waited for it to pass. He was still puzzled why no noise attended the engine's approach. As it came opposite, he noticed that the whole machinery had a ghostly phantom-like appearance. At the throttle stood a pale, wild-eyed engineer, while a specter-like fireman was pulling the bell rope, but no sound came from the bell. All this he observed as the train rushed past him like a shadow. He swears that the object he saw was a phantom train, of which there are several mentioned in railroad lore. This is from the Dalton Citizen, 1881. A subsequent witness or old news? That's not much to go on. For instance, there was only one witness, that is, unless the Phantom train was encountered again in October of 1883. Well, that's the month the North Georgia Citizen reported that an apparition previously mentioned in another newspaper had been seen again. Yet the facts of this new sighting suspiciously mirror those related in 1881. In both articles, the witness saw a headlight coming around a curve. He stepped to the side of the tracks when he became puzzled by the absence of sound. He then watched the apparition rush by. The two articles end a bit differently, though. In 1881, the witness claims to have seen two spectral trainmen. In 1883, the train is described as having been semi-transparent. Objects on the opposite side of the railroad were distinctly visible through the train. Some folks claim that even now, if you're lucky enough to visit Tunnel Hill in Georgia, which is very near Ringgold, south of Chattanooga, by the way, if you're near there where the locomotive general was almost escaped and stolen, you can hear steam engines in the tunnel chugging through the mountain, and you can feel the ground shake and smell the smoke, too. Not bad timing. I don't know if that means that like a gong would work, if it was a bad story or a good story. Now that's some ghost stories in the East, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Indiana, Illinois, and even down into Georgia here. But I have a story for you that involves New Mexico as well, the Phantom Brakeman. High up on Raton Mountain is a pass between Colorado and New Mexico. Before the railroad came, this was a high point on the Santa Fe Trail between Kansas City and Santa Fe itself. Up around there, 8,000 feet above sea level, stood a wayward inn owned by Uncle Dick Wooten. In those days of wagons making the trek up and over, Uncle Dick had been a scout and an Indian fighter, guiding many parties of Conestoga wagons over that ground. As he grew too old for such a life, he settled on the mountain with an inn, where new travelers could stop and rest during their own treks further west. He had a 27-mile road blasted through the rock and cleared space for a huge log cabin that was a perfect oasis for all those hardy pioneers. Uncle Dick had put a chain across the road by his cabin, and he charged a toll for those crossing the mountain. He made a good living of it and seemed quite content. Uncle Dick could manage most of the duties but needed help. He found that in a young man with red hair named Bill Rogers, who, while passing by himself, noticed the sheep herd needed tending, and in no time found himself partners with old Dick Wooten, more like a son than just a hired hand or a caretaker. In the coming years, the Santa Fe Railroad was looking for the best route west, and came to see the toll road set up by Uncle Dick. They were impressed by his road as the best to suit the laying of track, and made him an offer of $20,000. He said he had no need for so much money at one time, so he countered the offer, saying that he'd settle for a lifetime pass to ride the trains and $25 in groceries every month, calling it a square deal if they agreed. Good enough for him, right? The deal was made, and the railroad men said they would name the first engine used over the summit the Uncle Dick. One additional provision Dick requested was that for the railroad to hire Bill Rogers, since he knew the trains coming would be the end of his business with the inn. So Bill, getting assigned track duty, started with the track gang, laying the rails over Uncle Dick's land, and by December of 1878, the first steam train entered New Mexico as it passed his old log cabin. Bill transferred to duty as an extra brakeman with his post on the summit of the pass. Bill had a company shanty on the summit where as trains came to begin the downhill movement, he would climb aboard to assist the regular crew of brakemen on the car tops, working the brake wheels, controlling the train downhill through the dangerous curves ahead. Once they came off the mountain, the trains would slow and Bill would climb down and jump off to catch a train headed back up to his shanty. His job was in all kinds of weather, like a day like today. And winters are particularly punishing on that line and on that mountain. One particular winter night, Bill waited for 3 locomotives pulling a 12-car train over icy rails during an intense snowstorm, and he was soon aboard. Bill was unaware that the regular brakemen had been reassigned, and both on board now were as green as spring grass. They didn't know they should wait to begin working the brake wheels, and that soon caused trouble on the descent off the mountain. Holding the wheel of the swaying car he was atop, he tried calling out to them over the wind, crying out, "Go easy!" But they couldn't understand him or didn't seem to hear him at all. Snow had drifted deeply over the rails and caused the lead engine to stop abruptly, nearly knocking all the men off the tops of the cars with a jolt. They were halfway down the mountain, and the new men began releasing brake wheels to allow the train to start again. They had all but 5 open, causing the train to take off like a shot on the icy rails ahead. From the lead engine came the familiar series of whistle toots that calling the brakeman would be done to tighten the brakes, to keep the downward slide under control. They had a certain kind of code, almost the way Morse code would work, like a particular series of long and short blasts of the whistle would tell the brakeman whether to tighten the wheels or to loosen them up. This is right before adding air brakes to the couplers that are on the cars. So we get to ride on the tops and walk along the catwalk and grab that big wheel up there and tighten down the brakes or whatever. So that's what's going on right here with these men. And they're not paying attention to the calls. So, where am I here with it? Flat, okay. To keep the downward slide in control. Bill needed these new men to go to their duties, but they were flat on the car roofs, laying down flat, terrified of the train being out of control. Bill worked frantically as fast as he could on the rocking car tops, the train picking up speed. As he looked ahead to the engines and then the conductor who was back in the caboose, he saw all had jumped to avoid going over the side of the mountain at an upcoming curve. After getting up from the jumps, they stood in the snow along the track watching, and it was the last they saw of the train, with one lone brakeman atop a boxcar before the whole train disappeared, plunging down a rocky gorge. The next day, after the storm had passed, 3 bodies were found in the wreckage. Not one whole body could be put together, and the heads were so broken that no faces could be identified. The conductor was sure they were his crew, including extra brakeman Bill Rogers. No new man signed on for Bill's job as the swingman, as they called it, so for the next few days, that winter crews had to make do without the 3rd brakeman up and down Raton Mountain. But within a month's time, on a clear moonlit night, a train heading the opposite direction back toward Colorado crested the summit, and folks say that they saw a shadowy figure climb the side of a boxcar as they rolled slowly past the old shanty. The brakemen were already on the car tops, but never noticed their new helper. The conductor said he saw it from the caboose, but had no idea who it was. The extra hand was welcome because the train was moving too fast down the mountain with only 2 men, and the only notice was that the new man moved with sure footsteps and swiftly went to work. Air brakes had been added to the cars and engines by then, since the big wreck. But on this steep grade, the brakeman would still be critical to safely coming down the mountain. As they came to the bottom of the grade, the swingman climbed down and stepped off the car to the ground with not even a wave of his hand. At the next stop, the conductor rounded up his crew to ask about the 3rd man helping them. They had no idea who he was, assuming it was the new swingman. The conductor let them know the railroad had not yet hired a new man, but they all had seen somebody working the brake wheels bright and clear in the moonlight. The conductor said, "Well, we owe him our lives for having been up there," and one of the brakemen replied, "Well, then it wasn't a man, but either an angel or a ghost." And this went on for a long time, night after night. Even if the trains weren't slowing down, a brakeman would appear in the middle of the train, on top of the cars, attending to brake wheels and helping keep the train safely rolling. As soon as their descent would be complete, he'd vanish. The tale began to spread all across the Santa Fe Railroad that this phantom brakeman was at Raton Pass. Old Uncle Dick said often he believed it was his friend Bill Rogers because Bill was the sort of man to always do the right thing any way he could. On a night some weeks later, a hobo was found on the cars as the train reached the summit, and he was booted off by the conductor. As the hobo was walking away from the train, he grabbed at one of the air hose levers on the car to release the air. And that would affect the new brake systems and disable it, because the whole point of the brakes, all that air pressure in there keeps the clamps, or the calipers, off the wheels. And if that air line is broken, then the calipers close down on it. However, what this hobo did interfered with the movement of the brakes. So even though he disconnected everything, the brakes malfunctioned, and nobody knew that the calipers were not working. The crew expected the new brakes to do the job, and they were unaware that they had lost that option. So when the engine crew realized they had no pressure, they tooted the whistle to summon the brakemen to the car tops. By the time they were in place, nothing they could do would regain control of the train, rolling faster and faster downhill. They all made the decision to jump, and as they did, they all noticed one lone figure at his post, turning brake wheels as he went from car to car. They watched him work methodically, even as the train began leaving the track on a curve not designed for the speed the train had reached, and the engine, cars, and the brakemen all went over the side into a ravine in a great wreck. When the wreck was cleared, a brakeman's hat was found among the smashed up cars with some red hair still attached. A boot and the brakeman's bat were also found. You know, the brakeman's bat is this really thick stick. It's about 1.5 feet long, maybe 2 feet long. And the brakeman would put that inside the spokes of the brake wheel to get more leverage so he can turn the wheel quicker. And that's almost like a badge of office for a brakeman to carry one. And here they are finding one laying among the wreckage when not everybody's carrying one that's on the crew. But to this day, nobody is sure if the phantom brakeman was really Bill or a ghost with red hair just like his. Nobody's really scared yet, right? Okay, just making sure. My final story to share before I have some other things to share is the woman in white on the bridge. There's a railroad bridge crossing the Embarrass River, the locals pronounce it the Ambra, about 10 miles west of Vincennes, Indiana, just to the east of the storage tank farm of the old Texaco refinery on the outskirts of the small town of Lawrenceville, Illinois. The tracks cut between the refinery's tank farm and catalytic cracking machinery, which need water for cooling, so locating them near a river or sizable stream was a must. On the north side of the track is a small shack for the freight office of the railroad. That railroad I'm speaking of is the Baltimore and Ohio, then as maybe in the future you might recognize from the CSX line. But in those days it was one of the best-known Class 1 railroads in the country. As one of the country's first railroads, it had a lot of history and its own unique character, from the locomotives and cabooses it built in its own shops, to its home-built special-purpose freight cars, to its beautiful and elegant passenger service units, and their name train, the Royal Blue. The B&O was a class act in American railroading, and often had its own peculiar way of doing things, as all great railroads do. Sometimes I'd ride one of those B&O passenger trains across the bridge that I mentioned, and it would take me to dinner at my grandmother's house, but I never thought there was anything special about it then. Every once in a while, an uncle would ask me if I'd seen anything by that bridge, but I never noticed anything unusual about it. He always made me wonder, but I was only 10 years old and I didn't know there was anything there except the pumping station for the coolant water for the refinery. A few years later, I heard mumbles about some kind of a ghost story. It was something about a girl in a white dress. But that's a pretty common theme for ghost stories. For some reason, you didn't hear the kids whose dads worked for the railroad talk about it, though. By the time I was in high school, we had moved to the next town down the railroad line from Lawrenceville called Bridgeport. And that was where I heard a little more about the story of the girl on the bridge. She was said to be about our age, a high school girl, or maybe just a little older. The story begins with the girl in a very nice white dress, and then she walked along the track about a mile or so through the refinery in the tank car yard and out onto the bridge to wait for a train. When it came along, the engine crew saw her and she saw them. As they do, they blow the whistle to warn her off the track, but she made no attempt to jump or get out of the way. She just stood there in that white dress and she let the train hit her. A full train of cars moving at a respectable speed takes quite a distance to stop, and there's no way those trainmen could have kept from hitting her. At 40 or 50 miles an hour, there's not much left when a train hits a person like that, and it doesn't matter if it's a pretty girl or not. She was thought that she may have lost her boyfriend or her husband in the early days of the war, though I never heard exactly which war. I always assumed it meant that it was the Second World War, but some said it was the big one. No one knows for sure. Since we had lost a family member during the attack on Pearl Harbor, I sort of felt a little closer to that poor girl I never knew who died before I was born. Later, I changed schools and graduated and went on to the Marine Corps. When I came home to visit, I spent some time with a girlfriend I'd known from school. One night, I got to her home just as she was heading out, and she told me to come along to her brother's house. He worked for the railroad, and she thought I might like to meet him. When we got to his house, her sister-in-law told us that he had been crying, then laughing. Then he cried some more. And then he started getting very, very drunk. I'd seen a few drunks before already in just a short time in the Marines, and when they got to talking, they really had a lot more to say than they wanted women around them to hear, so I was a good ear for this guy. He'd start talking about his railroad work, then he'd follow it with some laughing, and he'd talk more about his work, and then he'd cry some more. But after a short time of nervous laughs, I started to wonder if he had more to say than he was doing, so I asked him what else was on his mind. He looked at me, gulped down a little more whiskey, and I noticed he was shaking like he was really cold. He'd seen her, he said, the girl on the bridge. He told me all about it. It seems that sometimes since that first time, the train crew would see a girl standing on the bridge right where the one that had been hit before stood. It was no ghost either. When the train had hit, there was blood across one side of the engine in front of the fireman's side, and as they went past, they could see the white dress go under the wheels. The first few times, trains had stopped there, and the fireman and head brakeman would go back to see who it was. When it got under the wheels on all the cars behind the engine, there'd be nothing there. They were told that it was probably a trick of some kind, a stunt by some local kids with a dummy and some white rags. That was the official explanation anyway, and for a while at least, the trainmen were ordered not to stop at that bridge, even if they thought they had hit someone. It was always the trains that were coming from the same direction as the time that the girl had been hit though, but it wasn't always the same locomotive or crewman. I found out that there were other people who knew about it, and I heard other railroaders talk about it after they'd retired and couldn't be laid off for having exposed it. It happened through the 1950s, I was told, when they first put radios in the cabs of the locomotives and in the cabooses so the crews could talk to each other and to the stations they passed. Sometimes a crew up front would hit the girl and see her go under the wheels, and they'd call on a radio back to the caboose so the crew in the back would look for anything unusual. The ones in back never found anything, not even once. The last guy I know of who worked for that railroad in that area told me he had spent nearly 20 years along that route, but he had never seen her. He'd heard the story though, and he promised he'd let me know if he ever saw her. Maybe things have changed enough since the refinery shut down or the railroad changed its name that she doesn't come along anymore. Maybe whatever she thought was worth dying about doesn't mean too much to anybody now, or maybe there's just been enough water passed beneath that bridge and enough trains across it that she can finally go to rest for good at last. Or maybe the next train along the way crossing that bridge, when they come to it at about the same time as the one that hit the girl the first time, maybe the very next one will see that same girl in her white dress with that same look on her face. And that is the end of my tales of horror on the rails for you. Hopefully that won't keep you up at night. Now, along with those 5 stories, oh, by the way, one of them I wrote. I'm not going to tell you which. You'll have to figure it out. But along with these 5 stories, every time I've presented this, I've opened it up to other people who might have a story of their own to relate about railroads, ghosts, and things like that. And I'm not sure if you have been to this museum, but it's in Strasburg, Pennsylvania. The State Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania is across the highway from the Strasburg Railroad, which is its own entity, and the State Museum houses the majority of the surviving locomotives of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the steam locomotives, and a number of the diesels as well, and equipment going back to the John Bull. There's a replica of the John Bull in there, and the rocket is actually there, now moved from the Franklin Institute in Philly to this museum. So it's one of the oldest steam locomotives in the United States, built in the 1830s as well. Every November, the museum hosts a military timeline event. So reenactors come in they're invited to come in for all periods that railroading has been working along with our military, so Civil War forward. And they finally got the idea right to put us near the equipment that's appropriate for our time period, how we're dressed. So obviously, I go as General Grant, and I set up near this, the oldest locomotive they have closest to the Civil War period was built in 1870s, called the Tahoe. And they have it on a set of track in front of a car that's a converted passenger car it was in service as a second-class smoking car. So half of it has seats, the other half has a baggage compartment. It's not really a combine, but it was designated to be a smoking car, and there's a platform on the freight area that the men could go out and smoke if they wanted to on the train. I mentioned that one first because the friends I have that work there, the restoration shop guys that restore these locomotives to that cosmetic appearance where they look ready to go again, I visit them often, and I get to go back in the shop and I get to see the projects they're working on. I get to crawl inside some things and, get into indulging my train habit with them. So they took me through one day. I had permission to go there and do photographs for an upcoming project. I wanted to get General Grant with trains for a project I was doing. Calendar I had was actually trains. It was horses, iron and flesh was the subject. So I was posing with trains or horses, and I had all this neat equipment in the museum to go to and had permission. So these guys were my escorts, and they were taking me around. And we went by the Tahoe, that locomotive. And they said, watch out for Bruce. And they pointed at the cab. And I thought they were calling the engine Bruce. I said, no, the engine's Tahoe. Who calls it? No, that's the engineer. And I'm like, yeah, okay, haha, funny. And they said, well, we had a medium come in the museum about a week ago. And she was there doing her own investigation. This woman knows nothing about trains other than that they're on track and you got to wait at a road to pass by, right? She knew nothing about the types of trains were in there. She couldn't tell you anything about the engine itself or the car behind it or any of the other equipment. And there's more to that. But she was walking with these guys past the Tahoe. And they were coming down and they were showing her, well, we'll go here. There's the car you want to go to. There's another car down the line that has a ladies' salon. And they thought she'd like to go see the car where the ladies' salon is. So they're on the way to do that. And they're walking by Tahoe and she stopped and went, I beg your pardon. And she looks up at the engine. And the museum guys stopped. They're like, what's the matter with her? And she said, she put her hands on her hips. She goes, I don't think so, sir. That's quite rude. And then she walked away. And as they're walking away, they're asking her, you can see the question marks coming off their heads. And she said, that man is very rude. He likes to look at the ladies, particularly at our hind ends as we walk by, as he said it. She claimed that the engineer was on the cab, looking out at her going by like hubba hubba, whatever he's doing as she goes by, making eyes or whatever. And apparently other people have also sensed this guy there, and his name apparently is Bruce. I set my Civil War camp stuff next to that. That's where I always put up my display. And at the end of the first day, like Friday when I go in to set up, and then Saturday night before I leave, I take one of my cigars out and I lay it on my desk and I'll say, Bruce, if you want this is yours, or gentlemen, because as she went by that smoking car, not knowing what it was, she was doing this. And she was like, oh, that smells. And they're like, what do you mean what smells? There's these two men smoking. And they're like, what are you talking about? She said, well, they're up here puffing cigars and they're just being, So she had a real tizzy about that. And they looked at her and said, do you know what that is? She goes, no, it's just a train car. I don't know, you call it a coach or something. She honestly did not know. And they told her, well, that's a smoking car. So she claimed there were two men in the long frock coats like Lincoln would wear and tall hats, big fluffy ties on them. And they were holding on to the rail and just having a cigar. So I always lay one up on that car for them too before I leave. And I'll say, gentlemen, enjoy. And then I leave. I never find those cigars moved. And that's one of those things I want to know. Like if I find those things moved, I'm going to go to the museum people. Let me see your film from last night, right? Because down the line where that parlor car is, I told you about, my buddies, when I was there for my photo shoot in my General Grant uniform, they said, come on, we'll go down to the parlor car. There's some, good woodwork in there. It'll be a good backdrop. So I went into this little rooms, little salon, benches in there. It's a really nice, upholstered, late Victorian kind of look to it. Golden age of railroading kind of thing. And my photographer's there. I'm posing, I'm sitting down, I have my cigar, and I started to sweat. I wear that stuff, I wear 2 layers of wool all the time. So I don't sweat in that unless I'm out in the sun in July, but I'm used to wearing it that it doesn't really bother me that much. But all of a sudden I had this intense feeling around me. And my 2 friends are out there and they're like, you okay? And I said, yeah, I don't feel like I'm alone in here. I felt pressure, and they kind of laughed. And they said, yeah, it's probably the women. And I didn't know. I didn't know it was the women's salon either. So what are you talking about? And I came out and they said, the medium, she was talking to the women in here. There were like 4 or 5 women that she was having some pleasant conversation with, like they were sitting like I'm talking to you right now. And the museum guys didn't see anybody. But we thought about it and I said, well, no wonder I feel like that. If I'm in the women's salon, they're probably upset that I'm even in there and they're probably like, get out, get out, get out. So I didn't hear or see anything, but I had that sensation from it. Another part of that museum, and when I set this program up to come up here, I gave Kathy some photographs to use if she wanted to do any promotional stuff. And I don't know if there were any flyers produced or anything. Was anything up like that? Okay. Because every host I have for these programs, I give them different things. And one of the pictures I gave them, I was dressed as I am now in front of one of the other locomotives that's in the museum that has a pit you can walk under to look at the bottom of everything on it. And that's not the main point of it, but that locomotive has ghost stories about it. And that's why I chose that one to be in the backdrop of my picture. My friends who do the restoration stuff, showed me a video, because up until that point, they were just giving me stories. And then they said, oh yeah, that engine's number is 1187. And they pointed and said, 1187's haunted. And I'm like, okay, at this point, I kind of want to believe them, you know, after this other stuff. And they said, come on, we'll take you back to the shop. So we go back into their office. They had this huge, well, like the screens that are here, they had these huge screens that they put blueprints up when they're restoring locomotives. And they were running the video on this big giant screen. And you see the firebox that's inside the cab, right, where they shovel the coal. They put a GoPro camera on that facing back through the cab over the tender. And they were inside, I don't know what exactly they were doing, but they were busy around the firebox itself. And the camera caught Al and Steve, who were doing the work. And then they were like, I said, okay, great. You're working on the firebox. And they said, yeah, look behind us. And I'm looking and they're like, wait. Well, on the tender, you know, it's the coal, where the coal is and the water that's back there. You see how the fireman would get up and he'd open the hatch where the water goes in when they come to a water tower, and he pulls down that big spout that dumps the water into the tender. And that looks a lot like this. There was a guy doing that behind them. He was walking out. He walked into frame, lifting his feet like he's walking across the tender, like he's pulling a chain, like he grabbed the spout and put it into this where the tender water goes inside the tender. And he was dressed like this, a lot like, you know, kind of a bib overall, railroader hat, that kind of thing, and just going about his business. And I've seen enough of that visiting Strasburg Railroad, and I worked at Strasburg Railroad as a brakeman and as a conductor. And I've seen the train crews how many times walking across the tender that saves it. It's completely recognizable. And I'm like, yeah, it looks like that's what he's doing. And they were like, well, the museum was closed. Because I said, who was he? He looks good. His kit looks really good. His clothes. And they said, no, there was nobody here. It was just us. We didn't see him and we didn't hear him. But when we ran the GoPro camera later, we saw him. So when I go by that engine, I don't take any chances. I always say, like, you're doing a good job, you know, and I walk by him at that point. So you never know. You never know. But those are some of my harrowing tales of ghost stories. Steve, my one friend that works there, he's a former, not a retired Marine, but he was a Marine for about 8 years. So he wouldn't pull my leg about this. But he said one of the cars they were restoring, really long passenger car, he'd come in the other end. It had steel doors on either end, so they're not easily blown by the wind. And he left the door open on the back end of the car, and he said he was up at the other end putting some tools down, and he heard a slam, and he looked up, and the back door was closed. So he went over to it because he thought the wind. This is a big steel door, and he's like pushing on it. He's jumping up and down to see if the vibrations didn't move. So he had really bad feelings about that car after that. A friend of mine, another conductor at Strasburg Railroad, some nights, because he lived in, I think he lived in Virginia, and he would come up to do 2 days a month at Strasburg Railroad in, to Pennsylvania. And he got tired of paying for a hotel room overnight, that he convinced management to let him sleep in one of the cabooses that's tied up at the station. Because it has, that's what it's for, right? When the trains, the Pennsylvania Railroad called their cabooses cabin cars. Because the idea was they treated it like a cabin. If you were on an overnight run, there's bunk beds, so it's like a cabin. And that's why the Pennsy called it a cabin car. But Strasburg Railroad has a couple that are set up that way. And yeah, okay, you can stay overnight. He said he was about 2 a.m, woken up out of a stone cold sleep. He felt the car shaking. And he thought it's got to be some people just coming around, messing with things. There was nobody around. And he heard slamming doors. And the caboose was tied on to the end of the train that's at the station, that's always there for the locomotive to couple to in the morning to pull the train out. So he looks down through the window of the caboose through the rest of the cars, and he's looking to see like shadows, if anybody moving around or anything, and he kept hearing boom, he kept hearing doors slamming on the cars. And anybody I've ever talked to about ghosts and all that kind of thing, they always talk about residual energy that's left over. And you think about something like a train car, because the majority of the coaches on the trains at Strasburg are late 19th century, early 20th century. Most of them came from the New Haven Railroad, up in Connecticut. Not that that matters at all, but that's where they came from. And they were used in commuter service. So how many people a day were on and off those cars, and how much emotional energy from all those people, all those times, could be on there that's causing those kinds of reactions. If you're like that, I'll say often, living in Gettysburg, I've had experiences there, but not with trains. But I always say you're a skeptic until you're not. So I'm not here to convince you. I'm just here to share the story with you about that. And at that point, every time I've done this is where I'll wait for somebody. If somebody has a story they'd like to share, like, well, we lived on a farm and a train would go by at night that we'd never see. I've had people tell me those kinds of stories. So if you have anything like that, I'd love to hear it. Does anybody have that? At this point, are there any questions I can entertain for you about that? Well, hopefully it was entertaining for you along the way. The last thing I can offer for you, Owen told me as we were setting things up, he said to me that many of you had commented about when I was here as General Grant, that you, if you're returning from that, thank you. He said that the compliments were overwhelming about the show, and I greatly appreciate that. And some of the people even tried to shame him for having missed it. So I think that's kind of fun to be that contribution. I understand Kathy and I have been talking about another return, so we're looking at possibly February when I'll bring General Grant back around for another show. I do come out to the Pittsburgh area in early February every year. I start my season off at Central Catholic High School in Pittsburgh, usually the Ford City and the Delmont Library. So I'll be in the area and we'll see where we can go with that. One little commercial note I have is every year, I mentioned earlier, I put out a calendar, and that kind of carries me through the time of year when I'm not presenting, like January. January is my office month when I do a lot of my booking and setting up of the schedule. And every year I try to do a theme with the calendar. I mentioned horses, iron, and flesh. One year it was my dog Maddie, who was my camp dog. And the year that she had passed, I decided I would honor her with the calendar. So every month was a shot of Maddie with me as General Grant's dog, which was fun because she did time travel. Last year, it was, 2 years ago. Last year was a celebration of all 10 years worth of all the living history impressions I do. The year before was camps and cannons. Now 2026, the subject matter will be Grant's cigar habit, 25 a day. So every image, and I've had a lot of events, particularly the one I just did in California over Labor Day that I go to. 8 or 9 photographers just followed me around all weekend. So I have all these great shots with cigars and things like that. And the story behind how do you even know it was, he did 25 a day, his staff was watching him because they had a betting pool about it. And I'm gonna have that story throughout the months of the calendar in little snippets. And I have an image where it's gonna be Grant's staff with the little ledger and all handing each other money. And General Grant's off to the side pretending to not notice it because he figured it out and he cornered them on it. So that'll be a story that goes into the calendar this year too. And it'll be mostly general, but I have some presidential images that'll be fun that are in there for that. I don't smoke 25 a day. Even when I'm in character, I might, at an event like I did up in Darlington in September, I was on site both days of the weekend. I smoked maybe 6 a day throughout the course of the day. And I don't inhale them, I'm just puffing on them along the way. And most of them are good cocoa Maduro, so they got a really good flavor and a good scent to them along the way. But if you're interested in the calendar, I have some order forms for that up here as well. Other than that, do you watch Storage Wars? You know the show. The people they auction off the storage lockers and all. An episode was being filmed when I was in California. My friend in Huntington Beach that runs the Civil War event there, he also does tech advisor work for Hollywood for different historical periods, and he portrays John Rollins, General Grant's chief of staff. So we're pretty tight. We've known each other a good long time. And I'm getting my camp set up on Friday of the Labor Day weekend. About 11 a.m. I started. He goes, "Can you have this done by 1 o'clock?" Well, yeah, I should. I had some help. And by 1 o'clock, he's like, "Are you done yet? Are you done yet?" "What's going on?" He goes, "Well, there's a crew coming to film Storage Wars." I'm like, "Well, okay, what's that about?" He says, "Well, they wanted me to evaluate 3 folding chairs." So somebody that got a storage locker found 3 Civil War era carpeted folding chairs, and they were looking for an expert to evaluate, their value. And of course, my friend Daryl was called to do that. And the crew that uses him, they've used him other times. They said, hey, can we do it Friday before Labor Day? He goes, yeah, come to my Civil War event. It'll be in the Central Park. And he wanted to use my camp as the backdrop for that. Of course, I had my uniforms with me and everything. And the crew shows up about 3:30 in the afternoon, and they're all deciding when they want to shoot. And he says, by the way, this is my friend Ken. He's our General Grant. And the crew's looking me up and down. And Daryl says, do you want him in the shot? I'm in regular civvies and I'm all sweaty from putting everything up. And I'm like, what am I going to do? And the guy looks me up and down. Oh yeah, get dressed. So we got full on in uniform. We're sitting under my shade fly in front of my tent. And this woman who bought the 3 chairs, she comes up with her folding chairs. And we did this whole thing where we evaluated them and told her because they were slot screwed. So that's a good indicator they could be from that period because we didn't have Phillips screw heads in those days. And she's bantering with us. Me and Daryl are bantering, and I gave her one of my hats to wear. And I offered her a cigar. She wouldn't take it. But they were the producers watching. They kept feeding us things to say, so we had all these little good jokes and everything. So if you get a chance to watch it, it's season 14. And out of nowhere, I got to be in a TV episode as General Grant, telling this woman about her valuable folding chairs along the way. So you never know. Sometimes you're in the right place at the right time along the way. But if there's nothing else I can answer for you, I'm happy to do that if one-on-one if somebody wants to say something. I'm staying down in New Kensington for the next 7 days with a friend because I'm doing this program and a couple other things around the area. I'll be at Cumberland Woods next Tuesday speaking about all the campaigns in Grant's the Western Theater, Tennessee and Mississippi. Sunday, I'll be up in Apollo, and I'll be talking about the friendship between Grant and Lincoln if you want to catch a Grant program and you're able to get out to those places. Other than that, I'll be doing this, or I'll be reading The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as Grant because one of his favorite authors was Washington Irving. So that was my connection to do that as well. So it's an interesting time of year because people aren't so excited about Grant, and this is seasonal. So you make those adjustments as you can. I'm really looking forward to bringing Grant back for you because as excited as you were about the other, I hope you'll be excited about whatever we decide we're going to talk about when I come back up too. So let me say thank you and enjoy the holiday season as it comes.